Today we are talking about Wolfenstein II: The New Colossus, covering its level and visual design, its gameplay and story, before finally considering some of the opportunities missed in MachineGames' third full-length outing. We'll begin with a run of the game's story point by point before moving on to the deeper critique itself. Let's get started. The New Colossus picks up right where its predecessor left off. BJ is saved from the smouldering remains of General Deathhead's compound and spends the following 5 months in a coma. He comes to when the Eva's Hammer, a U-boat that is headquarters to the Kreisau Circle, a resistance group fighting against the Nazi Empire, is attacked by the Aufschmerzer, an airship commanded by Frau Engel, last seen in the New Order. BJ, Caroline and either Fergus Reed or Probs Wyatt board the Aufschmerzer. Engel kills Caroline and BJ fights his way through the airship to release the Eva's Hammer, taking Caroline's body with him. The Kreisau Circle decide to liberate the United States of America from Nazi rule. BJ travels to the ruins of New York, the city having been destroyed by a Nazi atomic bomb. At the top of the Empire State Building, he makes contact with a resistance group who aesthetically resemble the Black Panthers, their leader Grace and a man named Super Spesh. BJ brings the group to the Eva's Hammer, where Grace takes command in Caroline's stead and details her plan to begin the liberation of America. The plan is to destroy the Oberkommando, the headquarters for the Nazi leadership located in Roswell, New Mexico. BJ goes to Roswell with a portable nuclear bomb and destroys the facility. After escaping, BJ takes a detour to his hometown where he confronts his abusive father, ultimately killing him and being captured by Frau Engel, BJ's father having sold him out to the Nazis. BJ is sentenced to death and executed on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in a ceremony that is watched by millions around the world. The Kreisau Circle, however, has developed technology that allows them to graft BJ's severed head onto a new body, saving him from death. With his newfound lease of life, BJ travels to New Orleans to make contact with another group of resistance fighters, escaping with them aboard the Eva's Hammer. Realising that they need to incapacitate the Aufschmerzer if their plans are to succeed, BJ travels to Venus to steal the plans that would make it possible to deactivate Odin, the automated security system protecting the airship, meeting Hitler along the way. BJ regroups with the Kreisau Circle where they hijack the Aufschmerzer, returning to Earth and killing Frau Engel where she is appearing on national television. In the post-credits sequence, BJ proposes marriage to Anya. When the New Order came out, it felt like a shot in the arm for the single-player focused shooter genre, which in 2014 was a bloated, tired hamster wheel of annual Call of Duty and Battlefield titles. In 2014, gamers have become conditioned to expect either mindless, monochrome shooting galleries populated with variously Eastern European or Middle Eastern antagonists, or massive shooting arenas set in a vaguely defined future, facing off against robot or augmented human enemies. The motives were invariably vague, ill-defined, perhaps even complex or ambiguous, but in some cases the moral messages of the games themselves bordered on the profound. The level in Modern Warfare where the player character dies alone and unremembered in the fallout of a nuclear explosion doesn't fail to register as an example here, and is just one instance of the conflicted dichotomy of an industry that at one point wants the player to enjoy, and even revel in, the mayhem that they are able to produce, while in the next wants that same player to reflect on the wanton destructiveness that they themselves have caused. Critically, the morally dubious antagonists and contemplative themes of these games were alienating ones. Demonising potential markets and making the player feel in any way uncomfortable with their role in participating in the destructive behaviours that these games engender in the name of entertainment is not the best way to make money in this business. Sure, the Call of Duty franchise has done well, but is there not more money to be made by shooting at people that almost everyone agrees are morally absolutely evil? While the Wolfenstein series has always been about killing Nazis, the reboot in 2014 was a doubling down, and it paid off. The New Order became the second best-selling game of 2014 in the United Kingdom in its first week of release. At the time of writing, the game has an 81 score on Metacritic. The New Order was so successful that Call of Duty released World War II 3 years later, the first game set in World War II released by that series since World at War in 2008. In 2018, the Battlefield series released Battlefield 5, their own first World War II game since Battlefield 1943 in 2009. People had had enough of killing Nazis and anything vaguely resembling World War II until the New Order came along. In the opening movement of the New Order, the player takes part in the aerial assault on Deathhead's compound, scales the walls of the fortress, sneaks and stabs their way around the interior before confronting Deathhead himself. Every facet of what the player can expect for the next 14 hours or so of gameplay is displayed here. This pre-credit sequence, much like a Bond film, is an exciting episode that is somewhat separate from what will follow. It is an exciting shot of adrenaline that acts as a mission statement for the reboot in general. You will have excitement, you will have tension, you will fight giant mech Nazis and mech hounds that will tear you limb from limb if you give them even an inch. Gameplay is slick when things get loud, considered and deliberate when the game is quiet, and whether using a knife or a shotgun, the disposal of regenerating health system so ubiquitous to shooters in the early 10s makes the gameplay seem fresh, fast, emphasising the heart-in-the-mouth thrill of reaching cover and awaiting health pack before your health bar is finally depleted. When BJ is blasted from the fortress and into the opening titles, gamers, publishers, developers and critics everywhere collectively breathed a huge sigh of relief. The New Order, despite its name, was like putting on a comfy old pair of shoes. They might be battered and have holes which let the rain in, but they don't pinch like the new ones do, and besides, if it relatively speaking isn't broke, don't fix it. If you were to look for any proof of this, you needn't look further than the opening minutes of the new Colossus, relating one of BJ's childhood memories, being abused at the hands of his father, interspersed with his rescue from Death's Head's compound. BJ has been spending time with a girl, an African American, and, well, BJ's father, Rip, takes great offence to this. He knocks his mother Zofia to the floor and drags BJ to the basement, where he ties the family dog Bessie to a post, ropes a shotgun to BJ's hands, and demands that he kill the dog. In life, intones Rip, you've got to make hard decisions, and sometimes you've got to punish the animals out there. It's kill or be killed. The old and the weak are doomed. Shoot Bessie, or don't. The scene ends and BJ awakens aboard the Eva's Hammer after his coma. Rip's prediction comes true. BJ is indeed old and weak and doomed if he doesn't roll his arse into a wheelchair and start punishing the animals that put him there, though perhaps not quite the animals that Rip had in mind, bearing in mind that he delivers this speech just after striking a woman to the floor and kicking a dog. We are already hard-coded to side against Rip even before he starts talking about the white man being robbed of what he has earned and straightening out the queer. For the Wolfenstein series, the real animals are Rip and the inhuman regime that he eventually turns to keep his business afloat. Rip's speech, however, does ring true, though. For BJ, his targets are different. His targets are Nazis. There's a sketch by Griff Rhys-Jones and Mel Smith simply titled Nazi Generals, where each general introduces himself to the scene according to which trait he possesses. There's the general who listens to classical music, the general who is always removing his gloves, the slightly pervy general, and the general with the ludicrous scar. When Jones enters the room, he introduces himself as the general with the limp. No, says one of the other generals in the room, the limp is me, I'm afraid. We recognise each general, for we have seen them before 100 times in films, books, television, scratchy black and white archive footage and so on, and that is what is so relatable about the sketch. The ease with which we can caricature Nazis makes them easier to kill because it simultaneously dehumanises them and makes them completely morally repugnant. Nazis are objectively wrong, and that is why players, viewers, readers feel so powerful destroying them, witnessing them being destroyed, or reading about them being destroyed in modern media. Despite this, the Wolfenstein series equivocates. The Nazi enemies are by turns inhuman, immoral, unfeeling, uncaring husks in an upright form. They are nameless, faceless, towering, technologically augmented behemoths that do not so much walk upon the earth as crush it beneath their boots. They dissect humans and graft them into machines. They decapitate women and rub their heads in the faces of their erstwhile comrades, and, in the new blood, conjure evils from the very depths of hell to aid them in their wicked schemes. The Nazi enemies are also flawed, just trying to do a job, victims of their conditions, husbands, sons, brothers, fathers and friends, just trying to survive long enough to get home safely. Both the New Order and the New Colossus attempt to humanise their Nazi enemies in various ways, and to varying degrees of effect. The New Order has BJ overhear a call between a commander and his wife, for instance, while the New Colossus has BJ sneak up behind two brothers talking about how much they're looking forward to getting out of the submarine they happen to have been hiding in and going home, just before you slit them both up with your knife. Both games are also incredibly generous with the diaries, newspaper clippings, audio logs and bits and pieces of environmental detail that reinforce the idea that, no, the people you are killing are exactly that, people. For BJ himself, his characterisation is clear. He was born, literally in the case of the latter half of the New Colossus, to kill Nazis. And yet there is a scene in which he lets a Nazi soldier go free in exchange for his gun and the keys to a rad set of wheels in the car park. The story that the New Colossus is telling, the story that is being told to the player through the level and visual design, and the story that is being told through the gameplay are at odds with each other to the point that they effectively cancel each other out. The New Colossus casts BJ and his band of followers as plucky rebels, the proverbial David to the Nazi war machine's Goliath. They seek to fight a guerrilla war, spreading propaganda and igniting armed insurrections in small areas all over the United States, bringing down the evil Nazi empire from within. Your trip to New York is in aid of making contact with a small resistance group hiding out there, and everything about the level design nudges the player towards approaching it stealthily, quietly disposing of guards, reaching the resistance without alerting the occupying forces to your presence. The game eventually forces you into a frantic shootout while BJ waits for a helicopter to arrive to help him escape, a frantic sequence on the top floor of the Empire State Building. It is an escalation that makes sense in the context of the level, but is also emblematic of a pattern that each level of the new Colossus follows more or less uniformly, whether the plot demands it or not. Each level begins with BJ undetected before he is discovered by either the player forgoing stealth voluntarily, or a lone enemy catching the briefest glimpse of BJ's ankle disappearing around a wall and alerting everyone with a swastika embossed helmet to his exact location, after which the only option is to spray anything that moves with as much lead as it can take before falling down. BJ kills all the enemies against massive odds before moving to the next area, where enemy alertness is reset regardless of the screams and gunfire heard from next door. There are, however, no mechanical or story implications for either the gameplay choices open to BJ, stealth or open combat. BJ is a master of the art of Nazi destruction and is equally adept at wielding an axe or dual-wielding shotguns, and the player feels extremely powerful in either situation. The gameplay mechanics are largely lifted wholesale from the New Order, which means that the action is all very exciting and the guns are gunny and the bangs are bangy, but the dissonance between what the narrative is trying to do and what the gameplay is telling you is very difficult to ignore. The new Colossus tells two stories almost diametrically opposed. On the one hand, there is the one the narrative is trying to weave, that of the plucky rebels creating insurrection against an almost impossibly vast and impossibly evil monolithic superstate. On the other, there is the story that the gameplay is trying to weave, that of an invincible super soldier who spits bullets and wreaks almighty vengeance on people who just goddamn deserve everything that is coming to them. The player is pulled in two directions, and in the end, neither ends up being the dominant one, or the best developed one. The game wants to tell an underdog story, but it doesn't want to compromise on providing the vicarious thrills that the first-person shooter offers to players, because it is exactly those thrills and the feeling of power that brings people coming back to the genre in the first place. What makes this dissonance so acute is the fact that the first level actually succeeds in marrying the aims of the narrative and the aims of the gameplay in a really mechanically interesting and thematically astute way. Confining BJ to the wheelchair makes sense in terms of his story because sure, waking up from a 5-month coma would leave your body weak and your muscles atrophied. The feeling of being underpowered, weak, broken is reinforced by the laboured, clunky movement of the wheelchair and the delay as BJ seizes the pistol in his lap to take out bad guys, before returning it to his lap again as he uses both of his hands to propel himself along. BJ is encouraged to use the environment to his advantage against his enemies, almost to the exclusion of anything else. Emphasis is taken away from your brawn and instead placed on intelligently baiting enemies into traps and taking them out that way. This friction between the levels of narrative that the new Colossus operates on and how gameplay supports or undermines this narrative extends beyond the overarching plot. Smaller story beats sit in uncomfortable juxtaposition too. When BJ meets Grace, the leader of the resistance group at the top of the Empire State Building, she describes the scene immediately after the atomic bomb fell. A vision out of Dante's Inferno, screams echoing through the bombed-out buildings like howling ghosts. She relates seeing a boy, the heat from the bomb had melted the skin on his arms and they just drooped like he was wearing a shirt that was a couple of sizes too big. BJ stands looking steely-eyed out of the window. "Monsters did this," he growls. "Not monsters," Grace replies, lighting a smoke. "Men." The city that you have just trekked through is dead, empty, a pile of rubble, a greenish tinge infecting the very air around you. It is toxic to breathe. The Nazi enemies all wear hazmat suits with rebreathers. The level is an indictment of the nuclear mindset, plain and simple. And in the next level you acquire a nuclear warhead, and in the one following that fit it inside a damn fire extinguisher and carry it through downtown Roswell on your way to detonating it inside the heart of the Nazi high command in America. The reveal is played for laughs, the irony of the most incendiary device ever created by man concealed inside something designed to put out fire is so on the nose it may as well be a pair of glasses. The nuclear apocalypse is both horrifying and hilarious in the new Colossus, depending on what is most convenient for the game at any particular time. The game refuses to choose to fall down on either side, and this abdication of any responsibility to choose is reflected in the choices that the game offers the player. Rip tells us that in life you've got to make hard decisions. Well, I've got to tell you, the new Colossus certainly isn't reflective of any life that the old man was imagining. BJ doesn't influence the events of the game, he merely facilitates them, enables them to come into being. He's the get stuff done guy, the shoot the gun guy, the drive the mech dog through the ruins of New Orleans guy. I don't pay you to think who can imagine BJ's hypothetical shift manager screaming into his big square face in yet another alternative universe that MachineGames have yet to mine. In the new Colossus, you roll into your wheelchair and move forward until the game ends. In 2019, we are moving through an era of game design that values and always seeks to improve player engagement with the environment and the story. The greater the number of ways that the player can interact with the game is generally considered a good thing. Player choice and the ability of the developer to design games that react to the players as they move through their worlds and environments is king. The new Colossus liked the way that the New Order implemented a stealth mechanic in almost all of its levels. It liked the way that it gave players different ways of approaching levels and rewarded players based on how they played. The shotgun lovers invariably charged into every encounter, meaning that the commanders were alerted and called in extra soldiers for backup. More soldiers meant more shooting. The knife lovers preferred the quieter approach, killing all the guards silently without attracting any further attention, being rewarded with little character moments or pieces of environmental detail as they slowly and methodically explored each level. The variety of gameplay choice widens about halfway through the game. Without giving too much away, there is an event and BJ is given a new lease of life. As part of this, our hero is offered the choice of one of 3 sets of contraptions, each of which affords him new abilities and ways of approaching the game. The Battle Walkers give the player more vertical reach. The Ramshackles allow the player to smash through walls and enemies. The Constrictor Harness enables the player to stealthily slip through small spaces. The problem arises when, depending on which contraption you choose, actually using it can lead to the player completely missing entire sections of gameplay. In my first playthrough, I chose the Battle Walkers because I liked the idea of being an alternative history ATST. In the crushingly disappointing New Orleans level, I was able to skip a whole section of the level, including 2 commanders, by accessing a ledge just above and to my left as I entered the area. I realised what had happened and went back into the section I had bypassed. The environment was there, but the enemies had disappeared. I wandered around the entire area. The dialogue still triggered and was loud enough that I should have been standing next to the soldiers talking, but they weren't there. Every level caters for each of the contraptions that the player could have chosen without the developers having the strength of character or trust in their design to deny options to players as a consequence for the gameplay choices they have made. The player's choice of contraption, whatever that was, doesn't have any functional impact on their experience of the game. I remember the moment that I made this realisation because it was the first time after receiving my chosen contraption that I was presented with an opportunity to use it. I discovered a blockage in my path with a telltale black and yellow hatching in the visual design telling me that an opportunity to use a contraption was in front of me. If I had chosen the Ramshackles, I could have smashed through the blockage. If I had chosen the Constrictor Harness, there was a small pipe nearby with the same black and yellow hatching that told me that I would be able to slither up it and into the building. With my Battle Walkers, I was able to reach up and access a ledge above the blockage itself. I dropped down on the far side of the obstacle where the exit to the pipe I could have entered had I used the Constrictor Harness just to my right. The choice of contraptions is an illusory one because no matter which one the player makes, the end result is just the same. Progress is always forward, down a corridor or along a walkway or through an air duct. The path may be wider, it may be narrower, but there's always just the one, with no opportunities to move away from it and find other ways of approaching any given situation. For a game that is at its best when BJ is blasting Nazis in the face, the New Order's stealth mechanics were as good as its open gameplay, perhaps great even, despite their simplicity. There was nothing on the HUD a la Splinter Cell indicating how hidden BJ was, nor indicators in the mode of the Far Cry franchise showing how close an enemy was to spotting you. Stealth boiled down to BJ, a knife and a Nazi's throat, but really it wasn't the simplicity that facilitated the New Order's stealth design, it was the design of the levels themselves. Spaces were designed specifically for stealthy players and to encourage stealthy play, rather than the other way around. Tunnels and side passages were built into the levels in ways that made sense, sometimes in campy ways, such as being placed behind giant paintings, sometimes in practical ways by placing venting ducts in underground bunkers. The design began to flirt with openly patronising the player, but the New Order's story progression eventually eliminated the possibility of or practicality of stealth as the stakes rise and the number of Nazis standing in your way increase. Maybe the reason I remember the New Order's stealth so fondly is precisely because it didn't outstay its welcome, and never quite reaches the point of indulgently ruffling the player's hair and showing them yet another instance of an enemy walking past a venting grate just before you're about to emerge from it. In the new Colossus, the rigorousness of the level design is weaker, and thus the stealth gameplay is weaker as well, almost to the point of head-banging frustration. There are more than a few levels where the commander mechanic is in place, but the design is such that the only feasible approach involves shooting Nazis in the face. For the longest time I tried to play the game the way that I was being told was possible, even plausible, but I quickly ran into situations where the level design made it impossible. The line between being invisible and being seen is a single keyboard stroke away, the line between enemies seeing you and raising the alarm almost instantaneous. After enough times, I stopped fighting the game's design and just went along with what it wanted me to do. Which is not to say that the game doesn't give the player the illusion of choice, the issues with the contraptions notwithstanding. In fact, part of my issue with the new Colossus is my suspicion that the game started life as a much more open-ended shooter before gradually being pruned back into the restrained, constrained mass we have in front of us. The game spends a lot of its early moments establishing the relative insignificance of BJ in the Kreisau Circle when compared to the Nazi Empire, and how they're going to start fires of resistance all over the country to bring the tyrannical forces of evil to its knees. About halfway through the game, BJ gets access to the Enigma machine in the helm of the Eva's Hammer. With this machine, BJ can decrypt the Enigma codes that are picked up by killing the Nazi commanders through the new Colossus main game, and by doing so discover the location of other Nazi commanders in America. Using the map at the helm of the Eva's Hammer, BJ can return to previous levels to kill those commanders. My theory is that there was a moment in the game's development where the main story would be put on hold at a number of points until the player had decrypted enough Enigma codes to locate and eliminate enough elite commanders to allow the story to progress. There may have even been a point at which this mechanic was used to locate other pockets of resistance in America, so that the player could travel to those areas to recruit resistant fighters to the Kreisau Circle's cause. The player might have been required to use this mechanic perhaps twice to actually complete the game, but further uses would have increased resistance to Nazi rule in America, perhaps even to the point where parts of the country were being taken back from Nazi control. Different endings could have been encountered depending on how little or how much the player engaged with the mechanic. Maybe characters could have been killed in certain branches, maybe enemy density could have been higher or lower depending on your actions. Maybe the inevitable sequel to this game could have loaded your save file and adjusted its story accordingly. The what-ifs extended to the distance, and the game that the new Colossus could have been, much like the horizon, remains further out of reach just beyond the curve of the world. We are left to make our judgments based on what we can see. The New Order's visual design, from the brutalism of Nazi architecture in occupied London to the electro-punk flavour of the enemy design, was fresh and interesting, especially within the context of the World War II shooter which the Wolfenstein series undoubtedly occupies, despite its futuristic alternative timeline setting. The new Colossus apes it almost universally, to the point where the environments the player fights through seem to be offcuts from the first game that weren't deemed of high enough quality. If you've seen one underground Nazi command base in this game, you've seen them all. Endless seas of concrete corridors, steaming nuclear missile silos, shadowy air ducts, industrial warehouses, black-clad Nazis, skeletal Nazi mechs, and the swastikas. The swastikas never end, swastikas so ubiquitous that I actually think that it has to be the developers making a joke about it. The man who paints swastikas on weapons, embroiders swastika flags, trims hedges into the shapes of swastikas, and shaves Hitler's moustache into the shape of a tiny swastika must have laughed himself all the way to the bank when he was awarded that contract. You know how in the old days when you opened up Microsoft Word and you began typing, that patronising paperclip would appear with some sort of fatuous message like, "It looks like you're writing a letter, would you like help with that?" Well, it feels like when MachineGames began brainstorming the new Colossus, Clippy appeared with, "Hey, it looks like you're designing a derivative half-assed cash-in sequel to a genuinely new and fresh take on the World War II themed shooter. Would you like some help with that?" And whoever makes the decisions could not have hit that show me the money button quick enough. The monotony is broken up by a handful of larger, open areas which lack the pressure of combat and allow the player an opportunity to breathe and explore. The Eva's Hammer itself is a labour of love and I think my favourite environment in the game. It is a hob world of sorts, the main living quarters of the submarine, complete with a shooting range, laboratory, cantina, bar, helm and living quarters, and the player returns to it at several points as the game progresses, being able to explore at leisure and complete mini-quests for the characters aboard. A lot of your initial time in the Eva's Hammer is spent running around and orientating yourself in an environment where each place looks fairly similar and the hallways between these places identical, so that you often have no idea if you're heading in the right direction until you do or do not get to the room that you're trying to get to. After your second time in the Eva's Hammer, the spaces begin to coalesce, and through a mixture of visual design, straight up signposts pointing out the directions of each area, and memory, I began to be able to traverse the area with little or no mistakes. Bombed Out New York was almost a Fallout parody, and certainly the opening section of the New Orleans level is at least an attempt to do something more interesting with the environmental design and pacing. The levels mercifully are not overly long, which almost keeps gameplay somewhat fresh, though there were moments when I was generally left thinking, is that it? Maybe the most memorable section of the entire game happens in the town of Roswell as BJ carries a portable nuclear weapon down Main Street, USA, but the only reason it lingers the longest in my mind is because of its bright colours, a stark contrast to the browns, blacks and greys of the standard FPS palette. Thematically and mechanically it adds nothing, merely acting as a bridge, though a very pretty bridge, from one level where BJ shoots Nazis down grey corridors to another level where BJ shoots Nazis down slightly wider grey corridors. Roswell is perhaps the only moment where the game concretely contextualises the new Colossus' setting, both in terms of era and in terms of geography. The player is continuously told that the environments they are fighting through are situated in America, but it is only really in the Roswell level that we see anything unambiguously definable as in any way American about the setting. We visit Bombed Out New York, where the piles of rubble and abandoned vehicles, coupled with the ubiquitous green haze crouching above it all, render the city blank, anonymous, lifeless. We visit New Orleans too, but the city is dead, full of an echoing silence. It is only in Roswell that we see a living America that is worth fighting for. It is only in Roswell that we see any heart in this game. The ingredients for a great development of the formula established in the New Order are present in the new Colossus. Wolfenstein III is inevitable, given how successful the series has been. The spin-off to the New Order, The Old Blood, was a different spin on the same theme. The upcoming sequel to the new Colossus, The Young Blood, seems certain to follow the same format. Sequels and sequels to sequels rarely meet the quality of the original. I don't know the future of the granddaddy of the Nazi-themed shooter, but if the new Colossus is any guide, I don't hold the highest hopes. Thanks for watching.